Welcome back to the Summit. Marc Guberti here, and podcasting is something I keep on talking about as this way to get new clients. And we have an expert who uses podcast interviews to generate new clients 24/7. So we're going to talk about how do we use these interviews, appearing on other podcasts, having our own podcast as a way to gain a steady stream of clients. Our expert who joins us today guides expertpreneurs on how to stand out in a crowd and exponentially increase revenues by leveraging their unique profit amplifier. She's the host of the Amplify Your Success podcast, the author of books such as We Wired for Wealth, and she's been featured in places like Bloomberg Business Week, Women's Day, and Parenting. She serves on the Women's Speakers Association executive team, and she has been a New Media Summit icon. That's how we met, and there's going to be a lot more value you guys are going to get in this session. So she is none other than Melanie Benson. Melanie, welcome to the Summit.
Woohoo! I feel like there should be like some kind of like running down a stage with that kind of introduction. Thanks for having me, Marc. It's nice to be back and connecting with you.
Melanie, it certainly is a pleasure to have you on the Summit, and podcasting is this continuously growing medium, and that we recently hit 1 million total podcasts. That number's always on the growth stage. So for people who maybe they don't want to start their own podcast yet, but they see the podcast interviewing as a way to expand, how do we get on more podcasts? Let's start with there, then build up later.
Sure. Oh, and for the record, whether you have your own podcast or you don't, but you want to share your message on more platforms, you should be guesting on other people's podcasts. It's one of the best ways to get more listeners to your own podcast. So how do we get on these coveted podcasts, the ones we admire, we listen to them, we think, oh my God, my topic, it would be great. So there's a couple of different approaches. The one tried and true method is I think it's really important that you have a solid magnetic title, a topic that's really relevant and impactful to the audience that this podcast host is serving, right? And one of the best ways to find that out is go listen to their show, see what they're talking about. And here is something that's a little trick, maybe a little tip that a lot of people don't think about is think about of all the topics this person's been covering lately, what's the problem they're creating by sharing those topics that matches what you do? Because every time we create content, every time we learn something new, that solution also will highlight another area, a problem, a unique opportunity. So go find those and then pitch your topic. Now, Marc, I usually say this till the end, but since we're already talking about it, there's something really important that a lot of people don't get, especially if they're hiring a publicist or they're using a podcast pitch service to get on other people's podcasts, is it's called the cold pitch. And I know you get them. I know I get them. Everybody's got a popular podcast gets them. But guess what? The little dirty secret behind the scenes that we all talk about is we don't like to book them. So one of the best ways to kind of overcome that is nurture people through social media. Actually, Marc, I don't know if you know this, but you and I were connecting on social media before we ever met in person, right? Like we both knew we were icons. We both knew we were going to be there, but we started connecting on social media. And what I find really valuable is I call it a nurture. Like you go and you warm up and you nurture these people, share the episodes, write and leave reviews, and be in conversation with them on social media. Twitter's an awesome place to do that. That is a way to break into a relationship with a high profile podcast host or producer that's going to override a lot of things that will be happening if you cold pitch them. So those are a couple tips to get in front of, but you got to have that hot topic and you got to have some kind of connection to break through all the noise that's landing in their inboxes.
And just for context, I do 5 episodes a week on Breakthrough Success. I probably get 20 emails a week. And you're talking about a lot of podcasters, they just do 1 episode a week. And they already have an idea for like what type of guest they want to have on their show, and they're doing their own outreach. So you may feel like you're a great fit, but remember, you are competing for one of those 52 spots. And because some people have ideas of who they want on their show already, maybe 40, maybe just 30 spots. So you have to have that deeper perspective than just the cold outreach email. And Melanie brings up the great point of know what the problem is that the listeners have and have a topic that is catchy, that solves that problem, and get in front of that podcast host on social media, tag them, do all those things. Now, let's say you do get on the show, you get on a bunch of podcasts. What do you say during those interviews to get people interested in the service that you have to offer?
Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of it all. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can craft a podcast conversation or an interview of any kind. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to just have this rambling Rose. And Mark, I'm sure you had some of those guests who they have so much brilliance. They're really probably big names. They've got a lot of great stuff going on, but somehow they show up and none of their content comes together. They're telling a story over here. They ramble for 15 minutes. And then you're like, wait, I'm the host. Can I get a word in? I want to ask you another question. And poof, the time's gone. And what I found is, I didn't used to teach how to get clients from podcast interviews because I figured everybody was getting clients from podcast interviews because I always have. And what I realized very quickly was a lot of people don't know how to translate what works for them on a webinar into the podcast interview space. Mm-hmm. So here's what you need to do. I want to teach you how to get people out of interest because they got to get interested to listen, past intrigue, which is where they're leaning in and listening for more, and invested in wanting to work with you more. And that means you've got to have showstoppers. So there's a lot of things I teach to craft a really magnetic podcast interview or virtual summit spot. But the most important thing you do is learn how to teach in sound bites and formulas. Because look, we're going to have 20 minutes here. Most podcast interviews are somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. You don't have a lot of time to get your point across. So I like teaching things in what I call the bold influence formula. Okay. And that means you've got 4, maybe 3 sound bites that you're going to teach. And you're going to do that in a way that leaves people imprinted with a formula that causes them to want more. Okay, so a showstopper is 3 to 5 word that you can build around an acronym. You can tell it in a formula, whatever works for you. But when you do that, Mark, I know you've seen when this happens, all of a sudden somebody goes, oh, that's interesting. They're like, wait, say that again. That was really interesting. I want to remember this. And it causes them to rewind, listen again, write it down. And now you've imprinted your concept in their mind and causing them to want more. So that's one of, I have about 6 or 7 little techniques to really bring home the point and stand out and create some buzz around your message. And that's the one that I think anybody can do it at any time.
And going back to this idea of have the topic that's going to grab attention, some people like to have different topics. So for me, there's YouTube, podcasting, content marketing. We all have a bunch of different topics, but then have 1 or 2 key points you want to mention. Maybe it's an acronym, maybe it's a story, but have those key points that a lot of people that you'll mention in those episodes. A lot of people, they have origin stories and they talk about that in every single episode they're on. You're going to listen to the person 10 times. You're going to hear the same origin story 10 times because that's the type of stuff that engages with the listener and creates a better episode. So it is good to have those different things in place. When it comes to introducing your offer, do you introduce it as a strategy call link, as a here's my free opt-in? How do you introduce the offer?
Well, it depends on what the offer is. And this is where I think what we do in webinars and some virtual selling environments is very different than what you do on the podcast interview. On a podcast interview, and this is what I call building the golden thread. So if you can build a golden thread from your topic to your talking points to a next step, a call to action, you have an 80% better chance of getting your targeted clients to take that next step with you. What I always do is especially when I'm the host, I like to set people up and say, hey, we've been talking about this. How can somebody find that find the next step with you in your offering? So I set them up. But if your host doesn't do that, or you want to really juice things up, magnetize things even more, what I like to do is a technique called seeding. You can do that in stories. You can do that in your formulas. And so how that might look is, so when I teach my Get Magnetic messaging, the first two steps are all about learning to tell stories that sell. I just seeded my Get Magnetic messaging program. Okay, so we could do it with another way. If you're going to have a free offer or something that's a free resource that you're going to guide people to as a first step, you might say, in my 17 mistakes report, there's 2 or 3 mistakes that people make over and over and over again. Would you like me to tell you what they are? And then you've created a dialogue with your host about it. And now when you get to the point where you're going to be asked about a next step or you're going to make your offer, you've already brought it up once. Now people are listening for how do they get it. So I'm not a hard sell person. There's a lot of people that are very in your face with a lot of that stuff. I'm more of a, hey, I've got a next step. If this works for you, great. But because I've already started to introduce it in the conversation and explain how it works, now people are already looking for it, and it feels like a natural next step.
And the key thing here is the natural part, because there's so many people who will just push. So I'm just looking at my book, YouTube Decoded for my camera. And there's a difference between saying buy my book and then saying, like, talking about the journey of going from book idea to publishing the book, or how I got the knowledge and building a story where people are genuinely curious versus a buy now push. So it's being able to inject the offers into the conversation in a way that gets us to ask, like, can I hear more about that? What's this thing you're offering? What's the story behind it? And then it's just part of a conversation rather than one of these 30-second ads that plays in the middle of your favorite TV show. And just like, I'm done with these ads. Get me back to my show. So you have to do that in the interviews. And that's a really great point Melanie brings up.
Yeah. You brought up stories a couple times. I want to bring something home there because we hear a lot about stories. There's a lot of people that teach the power of telling stories, but how you craft a story will either fall flat and or bore your listener to death because they're like lost in the story. They don't see the point, or it's really going to bring them into an emotional connection with you. That's where we can build that know, like, and trust factor. And so I think there's several ways to tell a story. The origin story is one of them. I think another one that is really powerful is crafting stories that demonstrate your credibility. And so we might talk about how a client went through this process and they were really struggling with how to get any kind of leads from their podcast interviews. And then I would say how that person worked through the system and started getting better conversion and improving their results. And so you can see that you can build a story to tell a result. You can tell it to bring a teaching point home and your origin story, but really learning to tell short, soundbite rich stories is a really powerful way to build that connection and build up energy with the listener.
And it's those stories where if you have a client and they've achieved results that connect to the interview, you can say, my client did this. And then that's the inference. Hey, this person takes on clients. Maybe she can help me. And with the stories, how much prep goes into the story? Because a lot of people who they are seasoned, they go on a lot of podcasts. They don't want to over prepare. Like me, I barely even prepare for a podcast interview anymore. I just love the on the fly and I'm able to adapt to that. You also have people who they will look at the script, like how I was introducing you, but instead like have that for all of their answers. And then it's just like, I'm hearing a speech here. It's not an interview. So what's the proper mix of being way too over prepared with the story and just freestyling it and not covering the story the right way?
Yeah. And by the way, I think there is a sweet spot. So under preparing, especially if you're delivering a new topic or you're working with some new material, that's going to lend itself to rambling all over the place and not really connecting your dots well. and then over preparing and or reading a script. Everybody knows you're reading a script and it feels really artificial. So when I take people through my Get Magnetic Messaging program, many of them are really new to this. So what I teach them is I have a little plug and play template system where it's like, all right, write out 2 or 3 stories that would bring your point home in 2 to 3 minutes. Now, write out 2 or 3 different formulas that you would maybe teach this particular part of your work so that it's concise. And instead of sitting there reading it, what you're doing is you're practicing with it, you're working with it, you're using it over and over and over again, so it rolls off your tongue. So, I've been doing this for 20 years now. I've given this talk quite a few times, maybe around 100, I don't know. But, it's like I can pull different stories depending on what the person asks me. I don't have a script, but I've got these locked into my memory where I can pull them out as I need them. But I suggest you don't just try to wing it, but really craft them in advance and think of it like library books you can pull off the shelf and use when you need to.
And I like how Melanie brings it up, because you don't want to go in super scripted, but you do want to have those stories you can go back to. Sometimes you get really lucky and you think of the right story at the right time. But if you want to be intentional with turning podcast interviews into steady streams of clients, that's not something you do off the cuff. That's something that you have a very conscious plan of which shows you're getting on. You also have a very conscious plan of what are the exact key takeaways, what's the messaging that goes into getting those types of clients from all these different podcasts you're doing. And Melanie, I know you have your own podcast. I'm wondering if we go a little into how you're using your own podcast to attract clients for your business.
Well, it's interesting. I did a poll of the people that went through Get Magnetic Messaging, which is my 6-week program, and went through my Amplify Mastermind. And I asked them, how did they get to the point where they chose to enroll at that level working with me? And every single one of them said, at some point, I ran across your podcast episode, blah, 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 and I listened to it. And then I listened to a few more. And then I signed up for this, whatever my offer was, my free offer. And when I went through it, I knew I wanted the next step. So for me, 2 things happen. One, I'm constantly reinforcing my message and building a relationship with my clients. And that is how, number one way I attract clients for my own podcast. I want to just slip in here though, how podcast guesting also brings me clients. I don't just show up on the podcast episode and share it once or don't share it at all, which a lot of people never share the podcast episodes they're on. I turn it into a 24/7 sales force, because I know that on social media, I have people that have been following me for a really long time. So we constantly have a rotation of different episodes that I'm featured on other people's platforms, and sharing it over and over and over again, sharing my own podcast over and over again. It starts to move that, what we might think of as a cold lead pool, people that are just not doing anything, get them interested to listen and go through the intrigued and then invested process. So either way you spin it, the important thing is you don't just air it once. You don't just like get the episode and share it once. You share it over and over and over again. So you're creating ongoing visibility for the episodes that you believe are really going to showcase your work well to your target audience.
And I really love that idea. There is a lot to creating your own podcast episodes, promoting those, having the guests promote those, because it helps you grow your audience. But when you promote your episode where you were the guest, being on someone else's podcast, that gives you a better opportunity to showcase your expertise. Sometimes the host is able to talk, sort of like what I'm doing now, where you insert your expertise a little bit, but the guest is really the star of the show when it comes to the expertise you show. So that is a great strategy. Have that cycle set up where you're able to keep on sharing shows you were featured on, so they continue to gain traction and people get comfortable hearing you in different places. Melanie, I know you have a podcast. I also know you have a resource you want to give us, so we will have those links down below. I'm wondering if you could share with us, though, what that resource is, so people have a reason to follow you with your work.
Absolutely. And then I've got a follow-up thought for you on that podcast guesting. So the resource that I want to share, because I believe that if you're going to be out there podcast guesting, there are some pitfalls that are super common, and I want to illuminate them for you so you can steer away from them and do the things that do work. It's called 17 Common Mistakes People Make When Guesting on Podcasts and Virtual Summits and How to Avoid Them. And that is at melaniebenson.com/Marc Guberti. And I know you'll probably spell that for us as well. And what you'll find there are 17 of the things that people do that literally cost you the lead, cost you the client. And what you should do instead, there's a little mini training once you download it that'll unpack that a little bit and help you really assess. And if you're just starting out, avoid those pitfalls altogether. And Marc, I just wanted to circle back on that podcast guesting thing and how turning it into a 24/7 sales force, that's not just a line. I literally have calculated, I have an episode I did close to 7 years ago on one of the top podcasts. I almost didn't even do the podcast episode because this person was brand new when they invited me. Nobody knew who it was. And to date, I have generated around $45,000 in revenue.
Wow.
That keeps coming because A, it's a great episode with a great topic, but B, I keep sharing it. So people that don't even know who I am on Twitter run across it with the hashtags and everything, go listen to it. And they're like, hey, how do I get that thing that you talked about? So, I can go back and thread almost every podcast episode and look at the leads that were generated, look at the sales that ended up generated. And I can tell you that it's not a one-shot deal if you continue to nurture the visibility too.
Well, I mean, one episode, $45,000 spread over 7 years, and you get on many more episodes. I mean, that sounds like something I'd want to learn more about. So Melanie's resource will help you learn more about what she did to get those types of results, common mistakes people make that prevent them from getting the clients. So definitely make sure you grab that resource, which will be down below. But Melanie, thank you so much for joining us on the summit. It's always a pleasure to have you on a summit, a podcast, or anything of that nature. So thank you for joining us in the summit.
Thanks, Marc.